Hi, this is Christina Marie, and it's Christina Marie TV here on SF Live. The holiday season is here, and instead of going for the fruitcake or some sweater that they're going to return, I recommend that you get a very heartwarming book, a book that will teach you a whole lot and make you feel a whole lot. The name of the book is The Water Giver. It's a story of a mother, a son, and their second chance. I have with me the author of that book, Joan Ryan. Hi, Joan.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, this isn't your first book.
It's my third.
Your third. Now, tell me a little bit about where your background is in writing.
Well, I worked in newspapers up until 2 years ago. I worked, 20-something years, mostly in San Francisco. And the first 13 years, I was a sports columnist.
Oh, really?
So my first two books are sports-related. And then didn't write books for a while and moved over to news side and wrote on the op-ed page at the Chronicle, and then wrote the Metro column for a while at the Chronicle. And then my son had this accident in 2006, and so I took a leave of absence for 7 or 8 months. And then when it was time to come back to the paper, as you know and everyone knows, the newspaper business has changed quite a bit, and downsizing. So it was a good opportunity to leave at that time, and I had a book contract, and my son, even though he was out of the hospital, still needed a lot of attention, and so it was just the right time to leave. I will miss newspapers for the rest of my life, but they aren't what they used to be. So I don't miss what it is now, but I miss what it used to be.
Now, the book that you have written before, the books that you've written before are quite different than this latest book. What was at what moment of the whole story, which we'll talk about in a moment, did you realize that I should make a book out of this? I guess.
Well, as a writer, what you do is write. So I was still working at the Chronicle at the time Ryan had the accident, which was August 2006. So right when we went to the emergency room, I was already taking notes, because when you're a columnist, everything in your life is fodder for columns. You're always thinking, oh, can I get a column out of this? And the truth of the matter is, so just to summarize the story, my son at 16 was making skateboards, and he grew up with a lot of, learning disabilities, ADHD, and for 16 years, I really struggled as a mother. I didn't have those mothering instincts, and then to have a child who was pretty challenging on top of it.
Now, I'm a mother myself, and I think that a lot of us that are parents don't understand the patience and the very special, I don't know what it is, that's in a parent to be able to handle children that have challenges like that. How is that for you at that time?
Well, I think I ended up in my fallback position, which was my whole life, was if I could study it, talk to experts, that I could intellectualize my way through anything, because that worked in everything else. If I couldn't figure something out, well, I just studied and worked really, really hard, and I could figure it out. Well, it doesn't work that way with kids. And it certainly doesn't work that way as a mother. You can't do it paint by number.
Yeah.
And, frankly, I just was one of those women who didn't have the natural mothering instinct. So I really spent 16 years trying to, quote, fix my son. I had these 3-ring binders just filled with all this information and always getting the diagnoses. And, I'm sure it helped him to a certain extent. But over the years, I became more his relentless reformer than his loving mother.
So it's more of a distance that you're trying to work through the book in order to form that bond rather than just experience that.
Exactly, and not just love him and accepting. I really was raising the child I imagined I would have. I wasn't raising the child I really had, and I wasn't really appreciating who he really was and what his strengths were, because I was always focusing on his deficits, So here it was, August 16th, 2006. He takes his skateboard that he was building, trying on new bearings. We live in a little town in Marin. Wasn't wearing a helmet. He usually did, but he wasn't wearing a helmet. Going down a street, fell off. Obviously hit his head. These kids knocked on our back door and said, Ryan fell off his skateboard, which is certainly not the first time he'd fallen off a skateboard. So I said, all right, let me go check it out. And he was, the ambulance was already there, and he was strapped into a stretcher, but he was still conscious, and he was talking. He said, yeah, my head hurts. And so the EMT said, we're going to take him to Marin General and check him out. Maybe he had a concussion. And we're like, okay, we'll meet you over there. So I swung back home, picked up my husband, and Marin General literally is like 6 minutes from our house. So we
now
go,
at this point, you didn't think that it was anything very threatening?
nothing.
That
Oh, no. We just thought, oh, he hit his head, you know. So we go to the waiting room, and we're waiting, and anybody who's, I don't know if you've ever had to take your child to
Oh,
the
yes.
emergency room. Okay, so you know,
Yes, I have.
you usually are back there in those curtained rooms with your child, which we had taken right to the emergency room before. And so we're waiting in the waiting room, and I finally ask, you know, the receptionist, I said, what's going on? Why aren't we back there? He said, yeah, that's kind of odd. So he goes back, he calls back, and a doctor comes out and says, we're getting him settled. We said, all right, you know, how long can it take to settle one kid?
Right.
Wait another 20 minutes. A middle-aged woman comes through those double doors, and she says, are you Ryan Tompkins' parents? We said, yes. And I looked at her name tag, and it said chaplain.
Oh, no.
And that was, you know, and then your heart drops and your mouth goes dry, and you're like, why are we talking to a chaplain? And what had happened was, just in the very short ride from where we live to the hospital, he spun out and showed every sign of a traumatic brain injury. And so by the time we saw him, he was already in a drug-induced coma and had brain surgery that night, had a major bleed. But the problem was that his brain, which swells, just like if somebody, you know, hit you in the face, you would swell. Of course, if your brain swells, there's no room.
Oh, because of the
swell
skull.
because of the skull. So they had to do everything they could to keep the swelling down. And usually they can control the swelling, and Ryan's was not controllable. So they ended up, after within 8 days at Marin General, you know, having to remove the whole top of his skull to let the brain rise up and out like bread in a pan. So
I didn't even think that was possible. They actually removed a piece or a large amount?
Yeah, they first removed one side, and that wasn't enough. A couple of days later, they had to remove the other side because his brain was still, the pressure was still building, which of course you can stroke out and die. And what's interesting, I mean, a lot of this is kind of fascinating now in retrospect, now that he's fine, you know, that they keep the bone plates, as they call them, they keep them off like 5 or 6 weeks. And they store them. Some surgeons store it in the abdomen. Our surgeon stored it in a tissue bank over in Oakland. And then they just lay the scalp back on. And of course he has to wear protective headgear, you know, the whole time he's there. But if you push down, it just feels like kind of a water balloon. I mean, that was the freakiest part, just kind of pushing down and having no skull there.
Wow.
I
have to stop you for a minute, just because I can't even fathom what that would feel like as a parent, to be taking care of your son and coddling your son and making sure they're going the right direction, and then you're taking every precaution, and then he has an injury, and you're thinking it's not that big of an injury, and to have his skull removed.
Oh, I know. And at that time, the abnormal becomes normal. You know, like things that you couldn't fathom before, you're like, okay, that's what we need to do now. All right, we're going to do that now. And then the next thing, okay, that's what we need to do now. All right, we'll do that now.
Just piece by piece.
You know what? You so live in the moment. You know, I say in the book that, you know, if you ever really want to learn how to live in the moment, you know, you don't need to go to a monastery in Tibet. You need to spend some time in the ICU waiting room, because you just say, okay, how do we get through this hour? All right, now let's get through this hour, and let's get through this hour. And we had just the most wonderful neurosurgeon at Marin General, Dr. Mark Eastham. Although I joke in the book, I call him Dr. Doom in the book, because every time, you know, we felt like, okay, you know, some crisis happened and it got fixed, he would say, well, we're not out of the woods yet. We're not out of the woods yet. And we're like, no, you know, we're believing that everything is good. And it wasn't for a long time.
Now, at that point, do you ever feel sorry for yourself? I mean, did you ever say, why in the world is this happening to me?
No, we never did. You know, I never, none of us ever did. And we were surrounded by, you know, this great tribe of friends. And it's like, well, why not us? I mean, and things happen. And so when you go through crisis, as anyone has ever been through real crisis or tragedy, you wouldn't wish it on yourself, you wouldn't wish it on anybody else. But almost always there are amazing gifts that come out of it. One of them is that you learn to just say, okay, what happens, happens. It's not good, it's not bad, it shouldn't have happened, or it should have happened. It just happened.